December 1990, Vestavia Hills, Alabama. A quiet suburb where nothing remarkable ever seemed to happen. One cold morning, a 5-year-old boy left home for preschool and vanished somewhere between his front porch and the highway. No struggle, no witnesses, no trace. Just a truck, a name, and a silence that lasted decades. In the early winter of 1990, Alabama still moved at an unhurried pace. Landlines rang in kitchens, paper maps were folded into glove boxes, and the daily rhythm of small towns felt predictable. Vestavia Hills was that kind of place. Quiet, tidy, the sort of community where neighbors waved from driveways, and the mail arrived at the same hour every day. At the end of Pineview Street stood a modest brick house with a small porch and a single oak tree out front. Behind its windows lived a woman and her young son, 5-year-old Julian. Julian was a curious child with a gentle voice and a habit of collecting smooth stones from the yard. He kept them in a tin box under his bed and could tell each one apart by its color. He loved cartoons about the ocean and carried a stuffed blue whale wherever he went. His mother worked in an office downtown. She was organized, patient, a woman who measured time in lunch boxes packed and shoes tied. Mornings in their home followed a steady pattern. The sound of cereal hitting a bowl, the scrape of a chair on the kitchen floor, the call to hurry so they wouldn't be late. For several months, a man had been appearing at the same hour each day to drive Julian to preschool. He was in his 30s, quiet, polite to the neighbors, neither friendly nor unfriendly. People along the street knew his truck, a faded gray pickup that coughed smoke when it started, but they knew little about the man himself. To them, he was simply the one who takes the boy to school. On the morning of December 3rd, 1990, the weather was cold enough to cloud the windows. Julian stood on the porch in a knitted blue sweater, clutching the stuffed whale by its tail. His mother handed him the heavier coat he always tried to avoid wearing. He smiled, slipped the toy into his backpack, and waited by the door when he heard the truck turning onto Pineview. The man waved from behind the wheel. Julian looked back at his mother, lifted one small hand, and ran across the walk to the passenger side. She watched the door close, the brake lights flare red, and the truck move slowly down the street until it disappeared around the corner. It was an ordinary goodbye, the kind that happened every weekday. Nothing about it seemed remarkable. She rinsed the breakfast dishes, gathered her work papers, and left for her office as usual. By noon, the routine began to unravel. The preschool called, asking if Julian was ill. The chair with his name tag had been empty all morning. At first, she assumed there had been a misunderstanding. Perhaps the driver had mistaken the day, or the teacher had misplaced attendance. She phoned his number. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. A third call went straight to a busy signal. Her voice tightened as she dialed the school once more, then a neighbor, and finally the local police. By early afternoon, 2 patrol cars were parked outside the small house on Pineview Street. Officers noted the locked doors, the drawn curtains, and the silence inside. Nothing appeared disturbed. In Julian's room, the bed was neatly made, but a few shirts were missing from the drawer, along with the framed photograph that had stood on the dresser. On the refrigerator, one magnet had fallen, leaving a faint outline where a drawing once hung. His lunch, packed that morning, still sat on the counter. Neighbors offered what little they had seen. One woman recalled the gray truck leaving the street at about 7:50 a.m., heading toward the main road. She had noticed nothing unusual. Another neighbor thought she heard a car door slam earlier than usual, but could not say for sure. With no surveillance cameras, no traffic recordings, and no cell phones to trace, the information stopped there. Officers took statements until dusk, writing carefully in their notebooks. The wording of the initial report was exact. Child missing with accompanying adult. No witnesses after 7:50 a.m. That single line would become the foundation of the case file. There was no mention of a struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no immediate suspect. As the day faded, clouds gathered over the ridge west of town. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. Police lights reflected off the wet pavement as they finished photographing the porch and the driveway. Inside, the mother sat at the kitchen table, hands folded around a cup of coffee gone cold. The clock above the stove marked each passing minute with an even, relentless tick. By evening, the officers sealed the front door and advised her to stay with relatives for the night. She refused, saying she would wait at home in case he came back. One detective noted in his log that she insisted on keeping the porch light on. When they left, the house stood alone at the end of the street, its single lamp shining through the rain. That was the extent of what anyone could confirm on the first day. A 5-year-old boy left for school with a man known to the family. He never arrived. His mother discovered the absence before noon. The police recorded the facts, took photographs, filed the report. Outside, the weather closed in, muting every sound until only the rain remained. By nightfall, the water ran down the gutters of Pineview Street, carrying the day's chalk drawings from the sidewalk into the drains. The porch light flickered once and steadied. Beyond that small circle of light, the neighborhood was dark. And from that evening forward, no one saw Julian again. When a child went missing in Alabama in 1990, the response began with paper, telephones, and instinct. Within hours of Julian's disappearance, the Vestavia Hills Police Department called in assistance from the State Bureau. By the following morning, a corner of the precinct was given over to maps, creases worn white where officers folded and unfolded them across a long table. Pushpins and thin lines of red string marked gas stations, motels, and interstates stretching north toward Tennessee and west toward Mississippi. The work was methodical, not yet desperate, carried out by men who believed that every trail, if followed carefully enough, led somewhere. The first assumption was simple. The child was traveling with the man he had left home with. There were no ransom calls, no evidence of violence, nothing to suggest a random abduction. What made the situation urgent was its calmness. The man had withdrawn money from his bank account 2 days earlier, a detail discovered when investigators began checking local financial records. His mailbox was empty, his small apartment cleared except for a single cup in the sink. The landlord described him as polite and punctual, someone who never missed a rent payment, never caused trouble. He had mentioned once that he might go away for a while. Detectives followed the highway routes leading out of Birmingham, stopping at every service station that might have caught a glimpse of a gray pickup with a child in the passenger seat. Clerks tried to help. Most could not recall. One attendant remembered a truck like that stopping for fuel early that same morning. He thought he saw a boy eating a cookie in the cab, but he couldn't swear to it. The receipt book was checked. No matching signature. By the end of the week, the case had spread across 3 counties and yielded not a single verifiable lead. In the absence of clues, the search expanded on paper. Officers made lists of possible destinations, relatives in other states, campgrounds, motels that rented by cash. Every night they returned to the board, replacing old strings with new ones. The lines began to look less like routes and more like veins of a map bleeding outward with each passing day. The press arrived early, drawn by the symmetry of the story. A quiet neighborhood, a vanished child, a mother waiting under a porch light. The first photograph of Julian appeared on the front page of the Birmingham News, a grainy school portrait showing a small boy with a slight, uncertain smile, Television anchors repeated the details with the slow, deliberate tone reserved for tragedy that had not yet hardened into finality. For several evenings, reporters stood near the cul-de-sac of Pineview Street, their breath visible in the cold air, cameras trained on the house behind the yellow tape. When the coverage faded, the mother remained there alone. She stayed in the same house, answering every phone call, even the ones that came with no one on the other end. The police suggested she move in with relatives, but she refused. The porch light stayed on through the night. She told one officer that if her son came home, she wanted him to see it from the road. Her cooperation was steady, never emotional. She sat through every interview, corrected details, signed each form without hesitation. When detectives apologized for asking the same questions, she only said, "Ask again if it helps." Through that winter and into the next year, the case file grew thicker but not deeper. FBI agents joined the investigation, offering federal resources, vehicle registration databases, credit card tracking, postal change of address requests. Each new list of names led to nothing. The man's truck, never reported stolen, was not found. Without automatic license plate records or security cameras, the search depended entirely on memory. And memory, they learned, decays quickly. The following spring brought what seemed like a break. A driver passing through northern Mississippi reported a vehicle matching the description of the gray pickup. He said it was parked outside a roadside diner near Tupelo, occupied by a man and a young boy. Local police responded 2 hours later, but the truck was gone. The waitress inside thought she might have served them breakfast, scrambled eggs and orange juice, but couldn't be certain. She remembered the boy didn't speak, and that the man paid in cash. Investigators collected fingerprints from the table surface, but the rain that morning had blurred everything. The report was logged as unconfirmed possible sighting. For a few days, there was movement, phone calls, teletype messages to border stations, but the trail stopped as abruptly as it began. By mid-1991, the FBI produced an updated missing child bulletin. It featured Julian's photo, his height, eye color, and a brief note. Believed to be traveling with adult male, no known vehicle identification. Copies were mailed to police departments across the South, pinned to notice boards, taped to gas station windows. They weathered quickly in the heat, curling at the edges, ink fading to a pale gray. Strangers who read them felt a momentary sadness, then went on with their errands. The officers closest to the case rotated off duty, replaced by others who treated it as an assignment rather than a promise. The map in the station remained, red strings growing brittle under fluorescent lights. Once a month, a detective checked in with the mother. She always asked the same question. "Did you find the truck?" They always gave the same answer. Not yet. By late 1992, the investigation had slowed to occasional updates. The mother continued to live at Pineview, keeping her job, keeping her light on. She told neighbors she still ironed 2 sets of clothes on Sundays. It was not hope, exactly, but habit. She did not speak about the man who had taken her son, perhaps because speaking made it more real. When the Bureau finally reclassified the case, the notification arrived in the mail. It came as a single-page letter stamped with the federal seal. No further verified sightings. Case transferred to long-term missing child registry. The words were cold, procedural, but behind them lay a quiet concession. That 2 years of searching across state lines, of interviews, gas receipts, and phone logs, had led nowhere. That winter, the file was boxed and placed on a shelf in the regional office archive. The map, once covered in bright red string, was folded away, its holes patched with tape. The officers moved on to newer cases, the ones with noise and urgency, where people still answered phones. On Pineview Street, the small brick house remained unchanged. The porch light burned through the night, casting a faint yellow glow across the driveway. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary home. Just another place where someone had forgotten to turn the light off. But to those who remembered, it marked the edge of a story that had already begun to fade into the quiet distance of official language. Long-term missing child. No further leads. And that was how the first 2 years ended, not with discovery or closure, but with a line drawn beneath the final report, leaving space for a future that, for now, refused to appear. By 1993, the file of the boy from Pineview Street had grown thin at the edges, its papers soft from being handled too often. Newer cases took the front desks. Fresh faces replaced the old detectives who once promised answers. What had begun as a daily operation with maps and roadblocks had settled into a quiet routine of paperwork and waiting. The investigation was no longer visible, but it wasn't quite gone either. Just folded neatly into the background of official memory. In the small house at the end of Pineview, life continued in its narrow circle. The woman never moved away. Her co-workers said she kept to her schedule, arriving early and leaving before dusk. She told them little. Each evening she drove home along the same route, parked by the same curb, and unlocked the same door that still carried her son's handprint in faint dust near the knob. Inside, everything remained as it had been. Julian's room stayed untouched, the bed made, the shelf lined with small stones in a tin box, the curtains closed to keep the sunlight from fading the colors on the wall. Once a week, she dusted the frame of his school photograph, the one used in the missing child notices. Every December, on his birthday, she placed a small cake beside the picture. Sometimes she lit a single candle, sometimes none. There was never a party, never anyone invited. The gesture became ritual, a quiet act of resistance against forgetting. The neighbors noticed the cake box arriving from the bakery, then disappearing again the next morning. They learned not to mention it. The FBI kept the case formally open, though few agents could recall its details without consulting the file. Each year or two, the Bureau sent an updated age progression sketch to local authorities, a hand-drawn attempt to imagine how a 5-year-old might look at 8, 10, or 15. These portraits were made before computer modeling, rendered in pencil and pastel on gray paper. They never looked quite right. Too mature around the eyes, too symmetrical, as if the artist had drawn an idea rather than a child. Copies were mailed to the mother, who stored them in a folder but refused to frame them. She said she preferred the real face, frozen in time. By the late 1990s, the world had changed. The neighborhood had new families, new cars, new fences. The story of the missing boy became something people mentioned only when giving directions. Turn near the house with the light that's always on. Reporters stopped calling. Children who had once shared Julian's preschool class were now in college. Some remembered his name vaguely, like a story told long ago. The woman did not speak publicly about the case again. She continued to cooperate with the authorities whenever they reached out, answering verification calls, signing updated forms, giving permission for her DNA to be added to the new federal database. She remained calm during each conversation, thanking the agents politely before hanging up. To her, it wasn't hope exactly, but duty, as though she had promised her son that she would never close the door completely. Then, in the summer of 2001, something unusual arrived at the Vestavia Hills Police Department. An envelope with no return address. It contained a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. The handwriting was uneven, possibly written by an older person, possibly not. The message said only, "The boy is alive." There was no signature, no location, no demand. The local detective on duty that day reopened the old box from storage, laying its contents across the desk. He compared the letter to previous correspondence. The handwriting didn't match anything in the record. A forensics lab found no fingerprints, no usable trace of DNA, only the faint smell of cigarette smoke on the paper. The postmark showed it had been mailed from northern Georgia. When they called the regional office for assistance, the reply came quickly. Evaluate, but no evidence of authenticity. File under miscellaneous. For a few weeks, rumors spread quietly through the department. Some officers thought it might have been a cruel prank. Others wondered if it was a genuine fragment from the past. But with no other contact and no new leads, the letter joined the rest of the file, clipped to the back of the most recent report. Its message was too brief to investigate and too haunting to ignore. When the mother was informed about it, she asked to see the letter. She read it once, nodded, and said, "Then someone out there remembers him." She did not ask for a copy. By autumn that year, the small town's attention was drawn elsewhere. The country itself was shifting. Headlines spoke of global unrest, not of missing children. The porch light on Pineview continued to burn each night. The same 60-watt bulb replaced when it dimmed, always switched on before sunset. A few neighbors said they still saw her standing at the window sometimes, watching the street as if expecting a car to turn in. Others said she had stopped looking altogether, that she just turned the light on out of habit. Between 2002 and 2005, the FBI's periodic updates grew less frequent. The file, now labeled long-term missing, was moved to the National Archive for inactive cases. It remained accessible but untouched. The last entry before relocation was brief. No confirmed leads since original investigation. Case remains open pending identification. The words were precise, stripped of emotion, a sentence that marked the boundary between effort and acceptance. In the Pineview house, time was measured differently. The woman counted years not by calendars, but by birthdays missed. Each December she still bought a cake. Each winter she still replaced the light bulb on the porch. Dust gathered on the doorknob of Julian's room, but she never closed it completely. Sometimes she stood in the doorway, not entering, only listening to the stillness inside, as if the air itself might return a whisper. 12 years had passed since the morning he vanished. The world outside had grown faster, noisier, connected by wires and screens that hadn't existed before. Yet here, on the quiet street where it all began, nothing had changed. The same house, the same tree, the same light that glowed through the dark. And as 2005 drew to an end, the case existed only as a handful of aging papers in a box, a forgotten entry in a federal database, and a mother who refused to let the night go entirely dark. By 2013, the world had long since moved on from paper maps and payphones. Everything now lived inside screens, records, forms, even the ghosts of old names. In Cleveland, Ohio, the winter light filtered through the tall windows of an ordinary brick high school, where a senior named Julian Sanders sat at a computer in the guidance office, filling out his college application forms. Julian was 18, tall and quiet, the kind of student teachers described as reliable. He had a talent for computers, a fondness for drawing, and a calmness that made him seem older than his years. He lived in a modest house on the west side of the city with a middle-aged man, a woman he called Mom, and a younger sister who followed him everywhere. They were, by all appearances, an ordinary family, polite, private, unremarkable. The neighbors liked them. The man worked in maintenance, the woman part-time at a grocery store. Julian helped his sister with homework, mowed the lawn, and never missed curfew. In February, while filling out his FAFSA, the federal financial aid form required for college, Julian came to the section asking for his Social Security number. He typed it in carefully, double-checking each digit. The cursor blinked. Then a message appeared. Invalid number. Please, Re-enter. He frowned and tried again. Same result. Thinking it might be a website error, he restarted the form, checked the paper card in his wallet, and entered it once more. Again, the system rejected it. He tried from a different computer in the library. Still no luck. The message never changed. Later that week, he visited the guidance office, where Mary Ellison, the school's senior counselor, helped students navigate paperwork and scholarship forms. Mary was in her 40s, with reading glasses that often slid down her nose, known for her patience with nervous applicants. Julian explained the issue, sliding the printed error page across her desk. "It keeps saying the number isn't valid," he told her. She glanced at the paper, then at the boy in front of her, polite, composed, slightly embarrassed. "All right," she said, "let's take a look." She logged into the secure federal system, typed in his information, and hit submit. The same red message appeared. Mary frowned. "That's strange. Are you sure this is your correct number?" He nodded. She tried again, this time running it through a separate verification tool connected to the Social Security database. A few seconds later, the screen flashed a different alert, one she had never seen before. Possible match, missing child record, 1990. Mary blinked, unsure if she was reading correctly. She clicked for more details, but the page redirected to a restricted field requiring federal authorization. For a moment, she thought it must be a system glitch, maybe a misfiled record or a formatting error. But then she noticed the accompanying data. Male, born December 1985, reported missing, Vestavia Hills, Alabama. Her hands froze over the keyboard. She looked at the birth year, then at Julian's file in the school system. The same. The description line read brown hair, brown eyes. The match was too exact to ignore. Still, she said nothing to him. Instead, she smiled lightly and told him she'd check with the central office and call him back later that afternoon. When he left, Mary printed the alert, folded it into a plain envelope, and locked it in her desk drawer. Then she called the number at the bottom of the page, the one marked National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Law Enforcement Liaison. It took 3 transfers before she reached an investigator who understood what she was describing. The voice on the other end listened, then said quietly, "Please don't discuss this with the student. We'll handle the follow-up." That night, in an office hundreds of miles away, an agent pulled the original case file from storage, Julian Hernandez, missing child, 1990. The photo inside showed a small boy with a round face and a faint, hesitant smile. Beside it was a hand-drawn age progression portrait produced sometime in the early 2000s. The resemblance to the Ohio student was uncanny. Within a week, the FBI had discreetly opened a new file under a different name. Cross-State Identity Verification. Juvenile case, Cleveland branch. Agents contacted the local school superintendent, requesting access to Julian Sanders' enrollment documents and vaccination records. Every piece of paper they found pointed to a life that began in Ohio around 1994, yet none of it existed before that year. Meanwhile, Julian remained unaware of what was unfolding around him. He focused on his final exams, on college essays about technology and art. Occasionally, he mentioned to friends that he might study computer science. He told Mary he hoped to attend a state university nearby, maybe even work part-time to help his family with tuition. His world was small, ordinary, safe. But behind the scenes, things moved quickly. The Bureau contacted the Department of Health to check the authenticity of his birth certificate. The document, issued in 1994, listed a hospital that had since closed, and a physician's signature that no one could verify. The paper itself was genuine, but the data within it was not. 3 weeks later, the agents received authorization for DNA collection under the pretext of a routine verification. They coordinated quietly with the local police department and the high school. A toothbrush from the Sanders residence was retrieved through consent by the guardian, citing health screening. The sample was sealed and shipped overnight to Quantico. In Birmingham, Alabama, a different envelope was opened, one containing the stored DNA sample of the woman who had waited 23 years. The comparison request came coded under a standard reference number, not a name. To her, it was another procedural update among many. To the lab, it was just another test in a queue of hundreds. The analysis returned 5 days later. The report was only 1 page long, stamped in black ink. Result: 99% probability of maternity match. For a moment, it was only a number on a screen. But to the people reading it, it meant the missing boy from Alabama, gone since 1990, had been found living under a different name, unaware of who he truly was. The agents moved carefully. No arrests were made immediately. No interviews were scheduled until they could confirm the family dynamics. Officially, the operation remained confidential identity verification. The call came on a gray afternoon near the end of the school year. Julian was asked to report to the federal field office downtown for what the woman on the phone described as a routine verification interview related to his college paperwork. The tone was polite, nothing urgent, yet something in it felt official enough to make him uneasy. He told his guardian, the man he'd always called his father, that the school had requested an ID check for financial aid. The man only nodded, his expression unreadable, and said quietly, "Do whatever they ask, son." At the office, 2 agents met Julian in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. They were courteous, not intimidating, one older, one younger. The older agent spoke first, asking simple questions: his full name, date of birth, the hospitals he remembered visiting as a child. Then came questions that felt less ordinary. Had he ever lived outside Ohio? Did he recall moving from another state? Did he have photographs from before kindergarten? Julian frowned, thinking. He remembered boxes of belongings from a long time ago, and the story his father had told him, that the family had moved north after a messy divorce. But there were no photographs earlier than age 6, and he realized suddenly that he had never seen an infant picture of himself. He said as much. The agents exchanged a brief glance, then thanked him for his honesty. After a short pause, the younger one opened a folder and slid a printed image across the table. "We'd like you to look at this," he said. It was an age progression sketch, drawn years ago, showing a boy grown older, his features matured but his eyes still young. Julian stared at the picture, then back at them. The face on the page, brown hair, narrow chin, a faint tilt of the mouth, was his own. He blinked, unsure how to react. "Where did you get this?" he asked. The older agent leaned forward, his voice calm. "That image was created from a missing person report filed in Alabama in 1990. The child in that report would be about your age now." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to press against the walls. Julian looked again at the picture. He searched for something wrong with it, a detail that didn't fit. But every line, every shadow was his reflection. The agent continued, explaining that certain inconsistencies in his school and health records had prompted a review. His social security number, they said, matched one registered to a missing child more than 20 years ago. At first, he thought it must be a mistake. "That's not possible," he said. "I've lived here my whole life." But when they asked about his earliest memory, his mind drew a blank beyond scattered images. Rooms he couldn't place, car rides at night, the voice of a woman he couldn't quite recall. The interview ended gently. They thanked him. asked him not to discuss the meeting until further notice, and escorted him out. He walked home through falling snow, confused, clutching a business card he hadn't meant to take. That night, long after sunset, the quiet on his street broke with the flash of blue lights. The man who had raised him opened the door before the agents could knock. He didn't run, didn't argue. He simply said, "I knew this day would come," and held out his hands. His wife stood frozen behind him, the young daughter crying in the hallway. Julian watched from the porch as they led him to the car, his mind blank, the words "missing child" echoing in the spaces where memory should have been. In the hours that followed, the truth unfolded piece by piece. The fingerprints taken that evening matched those from the 1990 file. The name Bobby Hernandez, a name Julian had never heard, appeared on every page. The man had created new identities for both of them shortly after leaving Alabama, fabricating birth certificates, school records, and a new life under the name Sanders. He had married again, started over, raised his son as if nothing had ever been left behind. When the FBI released the DNA results, there was no longer room for doubt. The report stated in clean black type, "Maternal match confirmed, 99.999% probability." The missing boy from Vestavia Hills, Alabama, had been found alive in Cleveland, Ohio. Julian was informed privately by the agents who had first questioned him. They explained that his biological mother had never stopped looking, that her DNA sample, submitted years ago for cross-checking, had made the confirmation possible. They also told him what had been withheld until now. The man taken into custody was not a stranger at all. He was his biological father. The words landed without sound. He didn't know what to feel. Shock, anger, confusion, pity. The man who had raised him, taught him to ride a bike, helped with math homework, had also been the reason another life had been erased. For 2 decades, he had lived in a truth built on a single act of disappearance. News of the discovery reached Alabama within days. In a small house on Pineview Street, a federal agent made a call to a woman who had waited 23 years. When she heard the words, "He's alive," she didn't speak at first. The agent later wrote that she asked only one question: "Is he safe?" The Bureau's final summary was brief and formal. Subject located alive, identity verified via DNA, guardian in federal custody. The phrase sounded clinical, but behind it lay the end of a story that had stretched across half a lifetime. For Julian, it marked the beginning of something else, a confrontation with memories he didn't possess, and a name he had never known was his. The report closed with one last note from the lead investigator. Case reclassified, recovery, pending family contact. After 23 years, the boy from Pineview was no longer missing. Yet for everyone involved, his mother, his father, and the young man caught between them, the meaning of being found was only beginning to unfold. In Cleveland, the courthouse was a gray stone building that had stood for a century, its walls holding thousands of stories about guilt and grace. The case that unfolded there in late 2014 was quieter than most. There were no crowds, no television cameras waiting on the steps, no shouting reporters. The headlines had already faded, replaced by other news. What remained was paperwork and a man in custody, charged under a name that wasn't his own. The defendant was 53 years old. The record called him Bobby Hernandez, though for nearly half his life he had lived as someone else. His list of charges was precise and unemotional: interference with custody, falsification of records, identity fraud. The legal language reduced everything to form and category, as though the past 23 years could be itemized and measured in statutes. In court, he appeared calm. His hair was thinner now, his voice low, almost courteous. When the judge asked if he understood the charges, He answered yes without hesitation. His public defender argued that he had not acted out of cruelty or profit, but out of fear. Fear of losing his child in a custody battle. Fear of being cut out of his son's life. The prosecutor countered that intention did not erase harm, that the man had taken a child's entire identity and turned it into a lie. Through it all, Julian sat quietly at the back of the courtroom. He was 19 by then, a college freshman, still learning how to live with two conflicting truths: that the man in the defendant's chair had committed a crime, and that he was also the person who had raised him, taught him to read, helped him with algebra, sat beside him at school plays. There was no easy way to reconcile those images. He did not speak to reporters. When asked for comment, he gave a written statement through his attorney. "I'm cooperating with authorities. I need time to understand everything that has happened. Please respect my privacy." It was the kind of sentence that sounded composed, but was really a shield against a storm of questions. During the proceedings, agents from the FBI testified about the process that had led to the discovery: the FAFSA alert, the DNA confirmation, the reconstruction of false documents. Each fact was delivered plainly, stripped of emotion. The court clerk recorded it all. At one point, the judge asked if the defendant wished to say anything before sentencing. The man looked up and said, "I know what I did was wrong. I just wanted to keep him with me." There was no defense beyond that. The sentence was formal: 4 years for kidnapping and identity fraud, to be served concurrently, with parole eligibility after 2. The judge concluded by saying, "The court acknowledges the defendant's cooperation and the victim's request for privacy." Then the gavel came down, marking the legal end of a story that had begun with a single morning drive in 1990. In Alabama, the mother received the news of the conviction by letter. She did not travel to Ohio for the hearing. Her only statement, delivered through a family friend, read, "My son is alive, and that is enough." The first reunion between mother and son took place quietly in a small room at a bureau office near Birmingham. There were no cameras, no reporters, just two people separated by time and circumstance. When Julian entered, he hesitated for a long moment, as though stepping into a photograph he'd seen too often. She rose slowly, unsure whether to speak. The air was heavy with everything, unspoken, years of birthdays, lost mornings, and what-ifs. He reached into his bag and pulled out a worn, stuffed toy, the same blue whale that had once ridden with him in the truck. Its seams were frayed, its color faded. "I kept this," he said. She nodded, her hand trembling as she touched it. Neither spoke for several minutes. There were no grand declarations, only small, halting words, his questions about her life, her quiet answers. At one point she whispered, "I always kept the light on," and he understood without needing to ask what she meant. The reunion lasted less than an hour. When it ended, he promised to return once he'd figured things out. She didn't press him. For someone who had waited half her life, another year felt small. Afterward, the Bureau issued its final memo on the case. The summary line was brief. Subject located alive. Recovery verified. Case closed. For the investigators, it was a successful resolution. For Julian, it was the beginning of something uncharted. A life with 2 histories and 2 sets of parents, one behind bars and one waiting in a quiet house on Pineview Street. He enrolled in a university nearby but remained largely invisible to the public. He kept his last name, Sanders, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because it felt like the only piece of stability he still owned. He visited his mother once more that year. The porch light was on when he arrived. It was still on when he left. Back in Cleveland, the house he had grown up in sat mostly empty. The woman he had called Mother moved away with her daughter, leaving behind only a few boxes and a broken picture frame. Neighbors said the place seemed smaller now, as if part of it had been taken with them. When Bobby Hernandez was transferred to a correctional facility, he made no request for visits. His only letter went to Julian. It contained a single line written in his careful handwriting. "You were the best part of my life." Julian read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. He never replied. In time, the story faded from the news cycle entirely. The court files were archived, the headlines replaced by new ones. But in Alabama, on Pineview Street, a small porch light continued to burn each night, a reminder not only of what had been lost, but of what had finally been found. The Bureau's last note, added months later by a reviewing officer, summarized it best. Case reclassified, recovery, emotional impact ongoing. For the system, that line meant closure. For everyone else, it meant the long, quiet work of learning how to live after being found. The following year brought no more courtrooms, no reporters, no official letters, only the slow settling of lives that had been rearranged by truth. By 2015, the file marked Julian Hernandez, recovered, rested in the federal archives, its pages sealed under case code 90A1174. On paper, it was finished. Outside the documents, people were still learning what it meant to go on living after something that was supposed to have ended. In Alabama, the house at the end of Pineview Street remained much as it had been a quarter-century earlier. The same oak tree still leaned toward the sidewalk. The same brass numbers hung beside the door. The woman who lived there, gray now at the temples, quieter but steady, had never left. Neighbors said she'd aged without softening, her gestures small and deliberate, her eyes sometimes distant. But she was no longer only waiting. She was rebuilding in slow, deliberate motions, repainting the front steps, planting flowers under the mailbox, repairing the shutters. The porch light still burned every night, but now it was habit, not desperation. Julian visited her several times that first summer after the trial. He drove down from Ohio alone, taking the highway his father had once used to disappear. The route felt familiar in a way that unsettled him. A long, unbroken line of asphalt carrying him backward through years he couldn't remember. He stopped outside the old house, sat for a while in the car, then finally walked to the porch. She opened the door before he knocked, as if she had been expecting him. They didn't speak much. Words had been exhausted long ago. She made tea, and they sat at the kitchen table that still bore faint knife marks from the day she used to cut his sandwiches into shapes. He looked around at the framed photographs, his kindergarten portrait, the missing child posters yellowed with time, the certificate from the Bureau confirming subject located alive. There was something both comforting and painful in seeing his own face framed like a recovered artifact. On his last visit before returning to school, he asked if she ever thought about selling the house. She smiled faintly and said, "I promised myself I wouldn't leave until you came back." Then, almost to herself, she added, "Now that you have, maybe I can rest a bit." That evening, before he left, he replaced the porch bulb for her, the small gesture she'd repeated for 23 years. When it flickered on, the light caught the reflection of the tin box on the shelf, still filled with the stones he'd collected as a boy. In Cleveland, life went on quietly. The woman who had raised him remarried and moved to another town. She avoided interviews, gave no statements, and when asked about the case, said only that she wished him peace. Julian didn't attend his father's parole hearing. He chose instead to focus on his studies, majoring in computer engineering. He rarely spoke of the past, even to close friends. When the subject surfaced, he would describe it not as a tragedy, but as a complicated history. The Bureau's periodic follow-up notes recorded small updates. Subject adjusting well. Maintaining limited contact with biological family. No public requests for assistance. In official terms, it was closure. but privately for those who had carried the file. It became a quiet legend inside the department, the story of the boy who found himself. Years passed. The porch on Pineview grew older but remained the same. The woman's health began to decline, though she stayed in the house with help from relatives. Each December, a small package arrived from Ohio, sometimes a book, sometimes a letter, once a photograph of a snow-covered campus. She kept them all in a box beside her son's childhood drawings. When she passed away in the late 2010s, neighbors said the house went dark for the first time in nearly 30 years. The bulb on the porch had burned out that same week. For a while, the property stood empty, its mailbox still carrying her name. A year later, Julian returned one last time to settle the estate. He walked through the rooms quietly, touching the walls, opening the window of his old room. On the dresser sat the faded stuffed whale, its seams frayed, its eyes dulled by time. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, tracing the stitches like reading a story he almost remembered. That night, before locking the door for the last time, he stood on the porch. The wiring was old, but he managed to fix the light. When it came on, the glow spread across the small yard, catching dust in the air. He didn't stay long. As he drove away, the house receded in his mirror, the light shrinking to a pin until it vanished around the bend. The file remained closed, its final entry stamped and signed. Case status: subject located alive. Emotional impact ongoing. For the system, it was another recovered statistic. For him, it was a line that would always divide his life into two halves: the years before he knew and everything that followed. Even now, sometimes, when he drives at night, he leaves the car's headlights on a little longer after parking. It's a small habit he can't explain, a ritual of light against darkness. Perhaps it's remembrance, perhaps it's gratitude, or perhaps it's just what happens when a life once lost learns, finally, to stay found. If stories like this move you, the ones that begin with silence and end with the quiet return of light, remember to subscribe to the channel. Each case we revisit carries a voice once thought lost, and every follow, like, or comment helps keep those voices from fading again.